So I have been doing some shooting with the FP. Took last week off because of the holidays, but we did do some shoots. And one of the first shoots I told you that I wanted to do was kind of an old school Rembrandt type of painterly look. And what I mean by that is when we learned about Rembrandt lighting, most of us, certainly I did, when they first teach us Rembrandt lighting, it's the 45-45 rule, right? Roughly 45 degrees out and roughly 45 degrees up, and you start getting the triangle under the eye. And then, of course, everyone's face is different. Some people have higher cheekbones, some people have rounder faces. So you have to move the light to adjust for that. And that gives you a very pleasant and very classic portrait lighting. But by old school Rembrandt, what I'm talking about is that really dark, high contrast, painterly look that he would get in many of his paintings, because Rembrandt used cross lighting. His studio actually had a 90-degree cross light. And so the way you get that really soft, heavy cross light is obviously you have to move the modifier closer to the side, but you want to, depending upon the size of the modifier, most times it's actually not pointing, right? When you do a 45-45, you're pointing the modifier down on your subject, but when you do it this way and you want that real super soft painterly look, the softest part of the light is on the edge of the modifier. So in these shots, the modifier wasn't actually on the subjects. It was actually pointed slightly away from the subject. They were just catching the edge of the modifier, which is where the softest amount of light is. And these were very low light. I wanted them to be low light, heavy shadows, lots of saturation, and I shot them very warm, between about 4,000 to about 3,200 Kelvin, very, very warm. I wanted it to be more like a candlelight or kind of a window at golden hour kind of look. So let's take a look at a couple of the results here. So I hope these images display well in this video and on your monitor, because sometimes they lose a little bit in the encoding. But this particular shot was just a single light. It was very dark. One of the challenges you have with the FP is because you can't use flash, if you are going to try to control ambient light, you really only have a couple of options. If you can't control the ambient light itself, you have to do what you would do with strobes, which is to raise your settings up to the point where the ambient light blacks out, and then you would bring your strobes in. Well, you can do that with continuous lighting as well, but the continuous lighting has to be very bright, and not all continuous light can get that bright, number one, and two, it could be very uncomfortable for your subject to have this big light, glaring at them. The other option is that you, of course, reduce the ambient light in the room itself. Now, because the FP has a limited flash capability, I didn't want to do flash. This was a continuous light, so Grace was in a very dark room, and just one light source, very warm, again, somewhere between 32 to 4,000 Kelvin kind of area, and off, to the side, pointing away from her. And I was concerned that maybe the FP wouldn't be able to get focus. But it had no problem. I was initially doing manual focus, that worked great. And then I went into doing the auto eye, and originally it was having a hard time locking in, but it was, I think, of settings. I went back and I reset everything on the camera and it worked fine. So I write that off as a user error, not a problem with the camera, because once I did that, even in the dark, it was doing very well. Of course, the 24 megapixel sensor had no problems getting the image in low light and getting it to be very low noise. 24 megapixel in full frame is kind of that sweet spot when it comes to low light now. Not that the 45s or the 60 megapixels don't do well in low light, but that bigger photo sites on those 24 megapixels really excel in low light, and it helps me for the type of work that I do, which is often compositing work. But in this case, it got that beautiful soft light that was coming off of the one light source and locked in, no problem whatsoever. So a couple of other things when I was shooting. One is that, like many of you, I use a back focus button. I started this when I was shooting sports, and I just carried it over to all the shooting that I do. I just love using back focus. And so I went ahead and I reprogrammed the auto exposure lock to be a back focus button, which is pretty common on these cameras. Not a problem, right? The only problem that I'm facing, though, is that because the camera is it doesn't have a lot of height, right? It's very compact, is that when I'm shooting and I'm doing that back focus, it's right where the dial is. And what I found is I kept hitting the dial, which is exposure compensation. Now, this is normally not a problem if you use an electronic viewfinder, because when you put it up to your eye, you're going to notice, oh, it's bright or it's darker, right? And if you're indoors and the LCD is nice and bright and you can really see it, you'll see that contrast and you might realize it's a little off. But when you're outdoors like I was, LCDs are just washed out, right? It's not a Sigma thing. It's just LCDs in bright daylight. They don't show up particularly well. So it's really easy, if you're not paying attention, to bump that dial and raise or lower your exposure, a third or two. And you take the shots and you don't realize until after that the exposure was a little off, even though you had adjusted it properly in the first place. And like I said, it just makes you more aware of it. You have to be more aware of that dial and more aware of the EV indicator, because normally, I dial in, I get the exposure, and then I don't even care about the EV indicator at that point. I'm looking at my composition, right? I'm focusing on my focus and where the subjects are. And I just don't pay attention to that, especially if you're shooting like this. You may not, like with me, with my not having glasses on, I may not even notice that the EV indicator is a plus or a minus at that time. So that's just a little thing that I ran into. I ran into it more than once. It's just getting used to the camera. I'm hoping the grips are going to move my hand a little bit away, because when you're holding that super flat camera, that's just natural that your thumb kind of rests right on that dial. So I'm hoping with the grips now, especially with this little thumb knob that they put in there, this little thumb grip part, that it will keep it away from the dial and it'll be a little bit easier to shoot. The other thing that I ran into with the camera that I actually found out that I liked, that I wouldn't think I was going to like, is the color button. Now, if you watched in my previous videos, the Quattro always had these profiles built in. You went into the quick select menu and you could change the color profiles. My Fuji has it. You just do a down press on the selector by the joystick, and it brings up all of the profiles and you can select one. And a lot of people will say that that's very gimmicky. And you're right. And that any of those profiles I can recreate in post. Not a problem. There's plenty of presets for like the Fuji simulations, but even stuff that isn't, I can always reproduce it in post fairly simple. That's really not the point though. The point is that when you're shooting, sometimes you want to change the way you see the world, to change the way you're going to take the photograph. And I found that because the button was physically here, that I was using it more. I was more aware of it. I know that's purely a psychological thing and that's purely for me, but I found myself many times actually going to this button to see the world differently and changing the composition based upon it. It just made me more aware of it. So, kudos for, Sigma giving me something that I didn't think I was going to want or like, and it actually turns out I kind of like it. So to give you an example of this in action, about a week ago, I went to a local park, and it was my intent to just kind of do a walkabout and take some test shots. Now, I wasn't expecting anything great because it was a gloomy, overcast day. We get a lot of those where I live this time of year. And so the skies are very gray and very dark. And of course, what comes with that is desaturated colors and no contrast, no shadows. But I wanted to go there anyways. And what I really wanted to do was, there is a man-made lake in the middle of the park and this big dock that goes onto it. And when the water's still, it can create a beautiful shot, even in these less than ideal conditions. But when I got there, there was a ton of families there for some reason that day on the dock. And I couldn't get a clear shot. And I didn't want to bother them because they were enjoying family time and I wanted to be respectful of that. So instead I decided, hey, you know what? I'll walk around the perimeter of this lake. And if I find anything great, I'll take a shot of it, but if not, I'll just head on downtown and we'll take some other pictures there. And so as I was walking around, there was zero discernible features in this lake. It's a man-made lake, so it was just smooth grass coming up to the edge of smooth water. And I got to the very end of the walk, and there was just one rock in this entire lake. That's it, one rock that was sitting out of the water. And I was getting ready to head back to my car, and I said, you know what, I'm gonna challenge myself. What can I do with this one rock with the camera and the gear and the setup that I have right here in camera? Because every now and then we like to do that with ourselves, right? We see something and say, there's no shot here, but I'm gonna figure out how do I make a shot out of this anyways. And so I walked up to the water's edge as close as I could get until I started sinking. I was about 2 feet from falling in the water. And I had the kit lens, the 45 millimeter that it comes with, so I couldn't do any kind of zooming. And I got down on my knee and I took a shot, and this is the shot that I got. So this, by all measures, is a horrible photograph. Right? There's nothing exciting about this photograph. It's framed horribly. There's all kinds of junk in the background. And so without doing anything in post, there was really nothing I could do with it given where the rock was at and where my location was. If I tried to pan up and try to frame it differently, on the top of that hill was a parking lot with a whole bunch of cars and ugly cars and a building there. And same thing if I panned left or right, it was all these other really ugly features that would come in. And here you can see there's a guy in the background doing something in the park and in a car in a building. And if I would have panned up and put the rock at the top, well, that would work if I could get really low to the ground and make the kind of a, make it look bigger than it really was. But I couldn't do that because I couldn't get close to it. So the rock had to unfortunately sit in the middle of the frame, and it's a tiny little rock, at least it looks that way, because I was shooting with a 45 millimeter and I had no way of zooming in. So without doing anything in post, I thought, okay, what can I do to make this look more interesting in camera? What can I do to make myself look at it differently? So I hit the color button on the Sigma FP and I put it into monochrome. And then I hit the quick select menu and went into its aspect ratios. And one of the things that Sigma cameras have is this crazy 21:9 panoramic aspect ratio. And when I did both of those, this is what I saw on camera. Now again, this is no award-winning shot, but it is far more interesting than what I had before. And this wasn't done in post. This was actually what I saw in camera when I made those two adjustments by going to monochrome and going to a 21:9 aspect ratio. So the whole point here is that I saw this rock in a slightly different view, right? I still couldn't pan left and right, unfortunately, or put it any lower in frame because of the horrible surroundings, but it did make for a more interesting shot. And then as a quick test, I loaded up my 35 art on there and did the same shot again. So this, you can see it has a little bit more blur and bokeh, a little bit shallower depth of field. So the actual water blurs a little more in the background. Again, this was not meant to be any kind of award-winning shot, but it shows you the difference between what reality looked like, which was this, and the fact that I couldn't get closer to the rock because of the water. I didn't have a zoom lens, that I couldn't zoom in. I couldn't change the framing on it, but with 2 clicks of the button on the camera, I saw something very different in the viewfinder. And when you zoom in, you can see, there's a huge amount of detail still in the shots. So that's my quick update on the Sigma FP this week. We looked at the grips. I love the deep grip of the large grip, but the fact that you can't access the SD card easily and that you have to remove the grip when you want to take off the loop, just for me, makes it difficult to use. The smaller grip is totally fine. It is a small grip, so if you have big hands, it may take some getting used to, but I'm hoping that it gets my thumb away from the camera a little bit so I'm not hitting that compensation dial as often as I am with the back focus. And it also allows you to take the loop off without having to remove the grip, which is great. The loop's fantastic. I highly recommend it. It's pretty pricey. I think it seems to me, honestly, I think it's priced more than what it should be to manufacture, but that said, I think it's an invaluable accessory if you are doing lots of work where you have to get that specific focus and you want to zoom in really close and you want to see your results because it looks like you're looking at a big screen TV, right, when you're looking through that loop. It's fantastic. I love it. We also saw that I used the handle that's used for video orientation, but found that I really actually enjoyed the way it made the camera feel, even as a stills camera, although it's a little bit awkward to carry around. It's very, very comfortable to actually to have. And then we showed some shots in low light where I thought it performed really well. And the fact that I am really kind of liking some of the manual or the physical buttons that it has for some of the features, like the color profile, which I didn't really think I was going to like. And that's it for this week. So stay tuned and we'll have some more videos coming out real soon. Thanks.